On a cold November evening in 1581, the halls of the Kremlin echoed with a sound that would haunt Russia for centuries: the agonized screams of a dying prince. But this wasn't death in battle or from disease. This was a son murdered by his own father in a fit of uncontrollable rage. The killer wasn't some common criminal or enemy assassin. It was Ivan IV, Tsar of all Russia, the man history would remember as Ivan the Terrible, standing over his eldest son with a bloodied staff in his hands and horror in his eyes. What you're about to discover isn't just the story of one tragic moment. It's the chronicle of how a man who started as Russia's most promising ruler descended into madness so complete, so utterly destructive, that he would systematically torture and murder his own family members. This is the tale of a Tsar who didn't just rule through fear, he became fear itself, turning his own bloodline into victims of his insatiable appetite for violence. The acts you're about to hear defied every principle of family loyalty, every concept of paternal love, every basic instinct of human protection. By the time Ivan's reign ended, he had transformed the Russian royal family from a symbol of divine authority into a cautionary tale about what happens when absolute power meets absolute madness. Ivan Vasilievich was born in 1530 into a world already soaked in blood. His father, Vasily III, had died when Ivan was just 3 years old, leaving the boy heir to a throne surrounded by ambitious nobles who viewed a child ruler as an opportunity for personal advancement. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, served as regent until her mysterious death in 1538, almost certainly by poison administered by rival court factions. Picture a 7-year-old boy, orphaned and alone, watching as the adults around him played deadly games for control of his inheritance. The boyars, Russia's powerful noble families, treated young Ivan not as their future ruler, but as a pawn in their political schemes. They fought brutal wars for influence over him, leaving trails of executed rivals and confiscated estates in their wake. But what truly shaped Ivan's character wasn't just witnessing this violence, it was experiencing it firsthand. The boyar families took turns controlling the young Tsar, and when they fell from power, their treatment of Ivan turned from neglect to active cruelty. Historical accounts describe how rival nobles would deliberately humiliate the boy, forcing him to wear shabby clothes, feeding him scraps, making him watch as they tortured his few remaining loyal servants. By the time Ivan reached adolescence, something fundamental had broken inside him. The boy who should have learned love and protection from family had instead learned that power meant survival, and survival meant being more brutal than anyone who might threaten you. The seeds of his future atrocities were planted in these early years of abandonment and abuse. When Ivan finally assumed full power at age 16, Russia celebrated. Here was a young Tsar who had survived the chaos of his minority, who had outsmarted the boyars who tried to control him, who seemed destined to restore order to a kingdom torn apart by feuding nobles. His coronation in 1547 was marked by elaborate ceremonies that proclaimed him not just Tsar of Moscow, but Tsar of all Russia, a title that emphasized his authority over every subject, every family, every life in his expanding realm. The early years of Ivan's personal rule seemed to justify this optimism. He implemented legal reforms, expanded Russian territory, and demonstrated the intelligence and capability that had allowed him to survive his dangerous childhood. His marriage to Anastasia Romanovna in 1547 appeared to provide the stabilizing influence he needed, giving him a loving partner who could soften the harsh edges carved by his brutal upbringing. But beneath this facade of successful rulership, darker impulses were already stirring. Ivan had learned during his youth that love made you vulnerable, that trust led to betrayal, that the only safety lay in being more feared than anyone who might threaten you. These lessons, burned into his psyche during his formative years, would eventually consume not just his enemies, but everyone close to him. The first signs of Ivan's true nature emerged in his treatment of suspected traitors among the nobility. Traditional Russian justice had always been harsh, but Ivan elevated punishment to an art form that combined creativity with cruelty in ways that shocked, even hardened medieval sensibilities. Nobles who were suspected of disloyalty didn't just face execution. They faced elaborate tortures that were designed to break their spirits completely before ending their lives. Ivan developed what he called divine justice, a system of punishment that he claimed was directly inspired by God's will. Suspected traitors were subjected to tortures that perfectly matched their alleged crimes. A boyar accused of speaking against the Tsar would have his tongue removed with red-hot pincers. A noble suspected of planning rebellion would be slowly flayed alive while his family was forced to watch. A courtier caught in treasonous correspondence would have molten metal poured down his throat. But Ivan's cruelty wasn't random or purely sadistic. It was calculated to send messages throughout Russian society about the consequences of crossing imperial authority. Every public execution, every elaborate torture, every creative punishment was designed to demonstrate that the Tsar's power recognized no limits, respected no traditional constraints, and would pursue vengeance against anyone who threatened it. Are you starting to understand the mind that would eventually turn this systematic cruelty against his own family? Because Ivan's descent into familial violence didn't happen overnight. It was the logical extension of principles he had already applied to everyone else in his realm. The turning point in Ivan's psychological development came in 1560 with the death of his beloved wife Anastasia. For 13 years, she had been the one person who could calm his rages, who could remind him of human compassion, who represented everything good and gentle in his increasingly dark world. When she died, possibly from poison administered by Ivan's enemies, something inside the Tsar shattered permanently. Ivan's grief was so intense, so all-consuming, that it transformed into a paranoid rage that would define the rest of his reign. He became convinced that Anastasia had been murdered by a conspiracy of boyars who wanted to destroy everything he loved, who sought to isolate him completely before moving against his throne. Whether this conspiracy actually existed became irrelevant. Ivan's response to his perceived persecution would make it real through the sheer force of his retaliation. Within months of Anastasia's death, Ivan had established the oprichniki, a personal army of black-clad horsemen who answered only to him and were tasked with rooting out treason wherever it might be found. These weren't ordinary soldiers or even secret police. They were instruments of terror who rode across Russia with the heads of dogs attached to their saddles, symbolizing their role as the Tsar's hunting hounds, sniffing out enemies of the state. The oprichniki were given unlimited authority to investigate, torture, and execute anyone suspected of disloyalty. Entire noble families were wiped out based on nothing more than Ivan's suspicions. Ancient boyar clans that had served Russian rulers for generations were eliminated overnight. The traditional Russian nobility, which had provided stability and continuity for centuries, was systematically destroyed by a Tsar who saw conspiracy in every gesture, treason in every glance. But Ivan's paranoia didn't stop with the boyars. As his mental state deteriorated, his definition of potential threats expanded to include anyone who had access to him, anyone who might influence his decisions, anyone who could potentially harm him. And that category increasingly included members of his own family. Ivan's treatment of his sons became a masterclass in psychological torture that would have impressed the most creative sadists in history. He didn't just demand obedience from his children, he demanded absolute submission, complete psychological surrender, total acknowledgement of his godlike authority over their lives and deaths. His eldest son, also named Ivan, bore the brunt of this treatment. As the heir to the throne, young Ivan represented both Ivan the Terrible's greatest hope and his deepest fear. The boy was the continuation of his bloodline, the future of the dynasty he was building. But he was also a potential rival, someone who might attract the loyalty of nobles dissatisfied with the current Tsar's rule. Ivan the Terrible's solution to this dilemma was to systematically break his son's spirit while simultaneously preparing him to rule. The boy was subjected to elaborate tests of loyalty that often involved witnessing or participating in the torture of suspected traitors. He was forced to watch as his father ordered the execution of nobles who had been kind to him, taught to understand that any sign of sympathy or mercy was a dangerous weakness that enemies would exploit. The psychological damage inflicted on young Ivan was becoming obvious to everyone at court. Palace servants whispered about the prince's nightmares, his sudden fits of trembling, his inability to form close relationships with anyone. The boy who should have been learning statecraft and diplomacy was instead learning that survival meant becoming as ruthless and paranoid as his father. But Ivan the Terrible's cruelty toward his children extended beyond mere psychological manipulation. He began incorporating physical violence into his educational methods, claiming that pain was the most effective teacher of important lessons. Young Ivan and his brothers were subjected to beatings that Ivan the Terrible claimed were necessary to toughen them for the brutal realities of rulership. The Tsar developed elaborate justifications for every act of violence against his children. When he struck his eldest son for showing mercy to a prisoner, he explained that compassion was a luxury that rulers couldn't afford. When he forced his younger sons to watch executions until they vomited from horror, he claimed he was preparing them for the harsh decisions they would someday have to make. Can you imagine growing up in a household where your father's love was expressed through systematic cruelty, where every lesson came wrapped in violence, where the man who should have protected you was the source of your greatest fears? Ivan's treatment of his wives after Anastasia's death revealed another facet of his increasing madness. He married 7 more times, and each marriage became an opportunity for him to explore new forms of domestic tyranny. His wives weren't partners or companions. They were possessions to be controlled, tested, and ultimately discarded when they failed to meet his impossible standards. His second wife, Maria Temryukovna, a Circassian princess, lasted 8 years before dying under mysterious circumstances that strongly suggested poison. His third wife, Marfa Sobakina, died just 2 weeks after their wedding. Again, poison was suspected. His fourth wife, Anna Koltovskaya, was forced into a convent after failing to produce male heirs quickly enough to satisfy Ivan's demands. Each successive marriage became shorter and more violent. Ivan would use his wives as test subjects for his theories about loyalty, obedience, and the proper relationship between ruler and subject. He would deliberately create situations where they had to choose between protecting themselves and protecting their children, then punish them regardless of what choice they made. The children from these later marriages faced even worse treatment than Ivan's eldest sons. They were born into a household where violence was the primary form of communication, where their father viewed them not as beloved offspring, but as potential threats to be monitored and controlled. Several of these children died in infancy under circumstances that suggested they were victims of their father's paranoid experiments. Ivan's youngest son, Dmitry, born to his 7th wife, Maria Nagaya, would eventually die at age 8 under circumstances that remain mysterious to this day. Some historians believe Ivan murdered the child during one of his rages. Others suggest the boy was killed by boyars who feared what he might become under his father's influence. What's certain is that by the time Dmitry was born, Ivan had already established a pattern of treating his children as expendable pawns in his larger game of power and control. But it was Ivan's relationship with his eldest son that would produce the most shocking act of familial violence in Russian history. As young Ivan grew into manhood, he began developing his own opinions about how Russia should be governed. He had witnessed enough of his father's brutality to understand its costs, had seen how the Oprichniki's reign of terror was destroying the very nobility that formed the backbone of Russian society. The prince began to speak out against his father's policies, arguing for a return to more traditional forms of governance that would restore stability to the realm. He criticized the endless wars that were draining Russia's resources, questioned the wisdom of terrorizing the boyars, who should have been natural allies, and dared to suggest that his father's paranoia was becoming a greater threat to the dynasty than any external enemy. These criticisms struck at the heart of Ivan the Terrible's deepest insecurities. Here was his own son, his heir, his supposed successor, publicly questioning the very foundations of his rule. The boy he had raised to be a perfect instrument of imperial will was instead becoming a voice of opposition, a potential rallying point for everyone who had suffered under Ivan's tyranny. The final confrontation came in November 1581, during a heated argument about military strategy. Russia was engaged in the disastrous Livonian War, a 25-year conflict that had consumed enormous resources while achieving little territorial gain. Young Ivan had been arguing that the war should be ended, that Russia needed to focus on internal reconstruction rather than external conquest. Ivan the Terrible saw this criticism as the ultimate betrayal. In his mind, his son wasn't just questioning military policy. He was challenging the fundamental principle that had guided Ivan's entire reign: that strength came through fear, that security required the complete destruction of all potential threats, that mercy was a weakness that invited destruction. The argument escalated quickly from policy discussion to personal attack. Young Ivan accused his father of destroying Russia through his paranoid cruelty. Ivan the Terrible responded by questioning his son's loyalty, his courage, his fitness to inherit the throne. The exchange became increasingly heated until young Ivan committed the ultimate act of filial defiance. He called his father a madman who was unfit to rule. Ivan the Terrible's response was instantaneous and devastating. His iron-pointed staff, the symbol of his authority that he carried everywhere, came down on his son's head with a force driven by decades of accumulated rage and paranoia. The blow shattered young Ivan's skull, sending blood spraying across the ornate chamber where Russian policy had been debated for generations. The immediate aftermath of the attack was almost as shocking as the violence itself. Ivan the Terrible, seeing his son bleeding and dying on the floor, immediately realized the magnitude of what he had done. The paranoid rage that had driven him to strike his heir evaporated, replaced by a grief and horror so intense that witnesses described it as a complete psychological collapse. Ivan threw himself on his dying son's body, trying desperately to stop the bleeding with his own hands. He screamed for physicians, promising them anything if they could save the prince's life. He begged his son for forgiveness, calling himself a monster and a destroyer of his own bloodline. For 3 days, he refused to leave young Ivan's bedside, watching helplessly as his heir slowly died from the wounds Ivan himself had inflicted. When Prince Ivan finally succumbed to his injuries, Ivan the Terrible's sanity appeared to shatter completely. He ordered that no one speak his son's name in his presence, then commanded that the prince's name be spoken constantly so that the memory of his crime would never fade. He alternated between periods of catatonic silence and explosive rages during which he would destroy everything within reach. The political consequences of Prince Ivan's murder were immediate and catastrophic. The heir to the throne was dead, killed by his own father in a moment of uncontrolled fury. The remaining sons, the sickly Fyodor and the infant Dmitri, were hardly suitable replacements for a prince who had been trained from birth to rule one of the world's largest empires. But the personal consequences for Ivan the Terrible were even more devastating. He had destroyed the one person who represented the future of his dynasty, the continuation of everything he had built through decades of bloody conquest and political manipulation. In a single moment of rage, he had undone the work of a lifetime and condemned his family line to extinction. The guilt and horror of his son's murder consumed Ivan's remaining years. He became obsessed with religious penance, spending hours in prayer and self-flagellation as he tried to atone for his crime. He consulted with holy men and mystics, desperately seeking some path to forgiveness for the unforgivable sin of filicide. But Ivan's attempts at religious redemption were constantly undermined by his inability to control the very impulses that had led to his son's murder. Even as he prayed for forgiveness, he continued to order executions and tortures for suspected enemies. Even as he proclaimed his repentance, he remained convinced that conspiracies surrounded him on all sides. The remaining years of Ivan's reign were marked by increasing isolation and paranoia. The boyars who had survived his purges gave him the widest possible berth, understanding that proximity to the Tsar meant potential death. His remaining family members lived in constant terror, knowing that Ivan's love could turn to murderous rage in an instant. When Ivan the Terrible finally died in 1584, Russia was left to grapple with the legacy of a ruler who had transformed absolute power into absolute destruction. The strong, unified state he had tried to build through terror and violence began fragmenting almost immediately. The time of troubles that followed his death would see Russia plunged into decades of civil war, foreign invasion, and social chaos. But perhaps Ivan's most lasting legacy was the demonstration of how completely unchecked power could corrupt even the most basic human relationships. He had taken the sacred bond between father and child and perverted it into an instrument of political control and personal gratification. He had shown that no relationship was too intimate, no love too deep, no blood tie too strong to survive the corrupting influence of absolute authority. The story of Ivan the Terrible and his treatment of his family stands as one of history's most chilling examples of power's capacity to destroy everything it touches. It reminds us that the same authority that can build empires and create order can also tear apart the most fundamental bonds that hold society together. In the end, Ivan achieved exactly what he had always feared his enemies would accomplish. He destroyed his own dynasty from within. The bloodline he had tried so desperately to protect through violence and paranoia was extinguished by his own hand. The family he had sought to strengthen through fear and control was scattered to the winds by his uncontrollable rages. Ivan the Terrible's reign teaches us that the greatest threats to power often come not from external enemies, but from the internal corruption that unchecked authority inevitably breeds. His story serves as an eternal warning about the price of placing absolute power in the hands of those who lack the moral constraints necessary to wield it responsibly. The halls of the Kremlin that once echoed with the screams of a dying prince now stand as monuments to the tragic consequences of power without limits, authority without accountability, and strength without wisdom. Ivan the Terrible achieved immortality, but not the kind he had hoped for. He is remembered not as Russia's greatest ruler, but as history's most perfect example of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, consuming not just its enemies, but everything and everyone the powerful claim to love.